Hello, Magnify Sisters. It's your friend, Brooke Walker. When President Nelson shared his conference address, Joy and Spiritual Survival, back in October of 2016, he said this: "Each of us has likely had times when distress, anguish, and despair almost consumed us." And then he asked, "Yet we are here to have joy?" Yes, the answer is a resounding yes, close quote, indicating that we are built for joy. In fact, today's guest, Lisa Valentine Clark, even commented that it's our birthright. But it can sometimes feel out of reach, especially if we are feeling nearly consumed, like President Nelson said, by our daily trials. So how do we set our sights on joy? Well, Lisa put it this way: joy is a creative act, not a formula. I can't wait to pick her brain about what that means. Lisa Valentine Clark, we know, we love. You know her as the host of The Lisa Show, the Council of Moms, and from BYU's Random Acts. She's a comedian, a mom, a podcast host, and an improv extraordinaire. That will probably come up in our chat today. She's been on this podcast a few times before. In fact, last time we chatted, Lisa, that was when you said that line. I'd never heard it before. You said, "Joy is our birthright." And I have thought so long and hard about that. I've quoted you many times in the last many months, and no pressure, but I find that every time I get the chance, the gift to chat with you, I feel like there's a pick-me-up line like that just kind of mind bombs into my world. So no pressure,
Thanks.
sister, but I want one of those today. Can we have another one of those?
You got it. Anything could happen.
I love learning from you. And you're so open and willing, but joy being our birthright, we're going to dive into that and kind of expand on that. And your perspective on this topic of joy is going to be articulated in a book coming out next month called Made for This. But for you, why joy, Lisa? Why do you find joy is a choice worth striving for and a choice worth making?
I think most of all because I have lived a life full of joy and abundance of it. And when I have found those moments where I didn't think that it was possible, where I felt absolutely, like President Nelson said, consumed by distress, anguish, despair, consumed by it, the thing that got me through those moments was knowing that it was temporary and that my equilibrium, my natural state of being was intended to be one of joy.
Your baseline.
That was my baseline.
So even when that baseline felt almost unreachable
and impossible.
Impossible. You clung to the fact that that's where you wanted to end back up.
Well, and as I studied, and as I thought about it, and as I didn't live with it, I thought, is this possible? And having the hope for it and studying it gave me the intellectual idea and knowledge that, yeah, this is actually what it's all about. This is the focus of how I want to live my life. This is the purpose. This is God's purpose. Then I was more determined then to look at it in a different way to be able to achieve it again.
Okay, I love that you described it as an intellectual process, because when we say just the word joy, people think of like heel clicking, skipping, dandelions blowing. It feels like this very emotion-laden experience. You're describing kind of an analytical approach. Like, no.
Yeah.
I know I can feel this. I know I meant to feel this. So you almost calculated your way back to that vibe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think anyone who's gone through deep despair, agony, depression, grief knows that part of the way that you learn to live with it or live through it is by not always trusting your feelings, right? And also not trusting every thought. So I found a lot of like, let's just break this down intellectually and experiment on it. You know, in the scriptures, it says experiment on the word. I take it like literally in a sort of a scientific sense too, of let's try this out. And the more that I've learned, the more that I've studied, the more that I've had experience with this, I realize that it's not just a nice byproduct of making good choices, but that joy is our birthright. It is our intended baseline from loving heavenly parents.
I love it. I love it. Today feels like, we've been peeling back the layers these last several weeks. Today feels like a crack it open, because you're coming forward with this idea that we can not just choose joy. That's kind of the first step, but we can create joy. We can produce joy. You and I are both producers in other jobs and spheres.
Yep.
And so this kind of really appealed to me, this idea of producing or creating joy. Speak to this challenge.
Well, I think that the way that we see joy is sometimes we limit it to an emotion, to a state of
Yeah.
being. Like, I feel happy. So that's joy. I'm feeling joyful. And yet I think in its purest sense, I feel like it's when you're almost like not conscious of it. I think it's synonymous with being in that creative flow that artists talk about. And I've certainly experienced. And you don't need to be an artist with a capital A of, I'm a painter and I make my living, creating art. I think that we are all artists, and that this is the lens with which I see the world, and which I feel like our heavenly parents, created us. We call them our creator. And so I take that literally. And so, yes, it's a choice, but it's a choice to do something, not just to sit and wait for it to distill upon us as the dews from the heavens, right? Like that this is something that we actually create. And the way that I have found in my desperateness to create more joy in my life at a time when for the first time didn't come very easily for me, I found it connected all these like creative arts that I enjoy, getting lost in the joy of that and doing that, actually creating something out of nothing is I think the way that it runs parallel to living a joyful life and creating that joy. And that is something that we can all access. And so when we
Yeah.
think about joy, I think a lot of times we think about our life circumstances, getting through something, overcoming something. And that certainly is. But I think, sometimes outside circumstances are so difficult to control and to manipulate. I haven't had any luck with that. But what I have had luck with is creating something new that has never existed before out of nothing, playing, engaging, acting, painting, singing, laughing, creating a new life, creating a different phase of life, rearranging a room. I mean, it can be anything, really anything in creating.
As you were talking, my mind was going back to a day like, I don't know, I think it was my last maternity leave. So 2 babies ago, but I remember this particular day, partly because I think I cemented it with an Instagram post, right? It actually happened because I put it
Right.
on the gram. But it was just a normal day. It was laundry,
Yeah.
it was mac and cheese,
Yep.
it was carpool pickup.
Yep.
And about halfway through the afternoon, midway point of the day, I stopped and said, I'm so I said happy, but what I meant was joyful, which we've come to distinguish is different. And it wasn't like a surge, it was like soft. It was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it was content, it was peace, it was soft. And that was just creating a day. So we can create something artistic or we can just create a moment and feel that joy that you described that
Oh,
sometimes
yeah.
doesn't land in this big explosive way.
When things feel so out of control or out of our control, the things that we are able to do with intention and with love and with
Mm,
the flow of creativity become the most important things.
yes.
So I think one of the biggest compliments that I've ever gotten in my whole life is when people walk into my home and they say, it feels really loving in here.
Oh, yeah.
And to me, especially now that I'm looking at becoming an empty nester soon, which is a totally different phase of life, I see it in a different way, right? Like the way that you decorate your house. And I'm not talking about like Pinterest worthy. I'm not even talking about the items, but even just the feeling and the intention, the love with which you have uh, in an, clean, orderly, I don't know, even just full of love, full of
A
people.
blanket thrown
A,
over an armrest
right.
or a picture in a frame.
A
Yeah.
picture that reminds you of a wonderful vacation, a book that made you feel something on a shelf, like those kinds of items, and a home
Mm,
full of that where beautiful words are spoken, where I don't allow people to insult each other.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Where there's good music, where there is a feeling that of things that are representative of my life,
Mhm.
being surrounded by those things and welcoming people in and making them feel comfortable so that there is a place for them to sit, a place for them to talk. This is one example of how you can create something. You get to decide and create your surroundings, and you get to create your life in a larger sense. Like when you wake up, what is the first thing that you think about? What do you spend your time looking at on your phone? What do you spend your time talking to? Who are you talking to? How do you take care of yourself or not take care of yourself during the day? How do you serve others? How do you build in a worship or a connection to God? Are you working on things that fill you up inside? All of those little tiny decisions, like when you think about it in a day, are creating your life. And once I started looking at it like that, of like, I get to create what this life that I'm living right now, which I didn't like, a lot of the things, the way that I'm living right now, I didn't choose. I felt like it was acted on. It's not like my best case scenario, but within my control is so many other things that I can create and live in that flow and that creative flow. And I just really feel like that's where you find joy. It's more likely to be there if you are a co-creator with God.
I'm not one who like hears voices very often, or the spirit doesn't quite speak to me so literally and verbally. But I remember a prayer in my 20s, just wholeheartedly asking for something worthy and wonderful. And that prayer concluded, and I got up, and I think it was my voice as prompted, probably by God. But the thought came, what are you doing about it? Like, it's such a basic principle. Like,
Yeah.
what, you know
Yeah.
what I mean? What are you doing about it? Like, you just spent 5 minutes on your knees, and yeah, those were beautiful wishes, dreams, hopes, asks, requests. What are you doing about it? That's kind of what you're describing as we set out to bring joy, create joy, produce joy in our lives.
Yeah, and I think that beyond that, once you do that, and you're saying, I'm willing to do, and because sometimes they're like when you have a broken heart, like it's hard to like, well, how do you fix that? Like I can't fix that on my own. I've got to like put that on the altar and ask about that. But what the creative process has taught me in that is that as you're creating a life that is joyful, where you feel like you can be healed, where you feel like you can be sustained, those kinds of desperate prayers. I think everyone has this experience of praying for something that is good that you want, and the answer is no, right? Like the answer is no. So then what? And really, in my practice with the creative arts, I realize that this happens all the time. You talk to a painter who talks about, well, what happens when you make a mistake. Kristen Yee talked about this in her conference talk about like, here's a big mistake. And it taught her this big expansive lesson about repentance and to see it in a new way. When I was like, well, I don't know. I don't feel like I can do anything about my grief. What do I do? And it was about creating a new life and creating a different life, one that I hadn't imagined yet, which is creating something new out of nothing and having that hope. You have to create hope. It doesn't just like appear. And it's been the hardest work I think that I've ever done. And yet, like in improvisational acting and painting, there are places I have like no one just sits down and writes a masterpiece, paints a masterpiece, performs like practicing and knowing you're going to make lots of mistakes, that you're going to ask for something and the answer is going to be no, and not
Yeah.
being so thrown up by that, but just to have it pivot you to do the next thing and to do the next thing and not thrown off by a no or a closed door or a mistake or anything, but using it as an opportunity to keep going and knowing it's part of the creative process, then I think makes the idea of creating joy more obtainable, right? It becomes like, of course, this is actually part of the whole process to it, instead of, wait, what now? What, and being so,
Shocked.
so shocked because we don't make good decisions in trauma when we're shocked, when we are, absolutely at our wit's end.
So don't let yourself be thrown off into that crazy space.
Well, yeah, this is life.
This is life.
This is how it was supposed to be. And that took me a long time to let that settle in my bones.
We've noted a couple of you've talked about how you've drawn from your life in the arts to help you garner joy. And you've labeled these as tools. I actually like calling these tools because otherwise they would kind of be these pie in the sky, lovely sounding notions. But when I think of them like tools, it goes back to that analytical approach that you described in the beginning. The first tool being hope, and you touched on that, but using hope as a tool in your life to glean joy.
Oh, yeah. There was a time in my life, for the first time in my whole life, in my 40s, where I had no hope. I was like, oh, I probably will always feel miserable and nothing will get better, or it will, but it will never be, I'll never experience the kind of happiness and joy that I've had before. And what got me out of that, first of all, was borrowing hope from someone else. Like I have a couple of close friends who, if they say something, I believe it, even if I don't agree with it, right? Because I know that they wouldn't lie to me.
That's a
And
good
I
friendship.
and I remember my friend saying, like, I know you feel that way, but I know that that's not true. And I thought, that kind of cracked it open of like, I know she's not lying to me and she's not giving me platitudes. So intellectually, that could be true. And if it could be true that I maybe could have hope, that is the birthplace of hope, right?
But
Like
that was a
that
point
is
zero zero
just,
one percentage,
yes.
maybe. Yeah.
And then also, really, what kind of opened up the door a little bit more was a poem. So, of course, it was something artistic that I read about hope, of what if, and basically asking about what if there is so much that you don't know that you don't even know what to ask for? Isn't it a possibility that there are things that you just don't know? Like, for example, like I didn't see the big tragedies that have happened in my life. I did not see them coming. I didn't, and I was surprised by them. So couldn't the opposite be true, or of equal force? Couldn't something so wonderful and great happen? Intellectually, I thought, yeah, that has to be true because I couldn't see the bad. So I probably won't be able to see the good too. Where hope is born, then I really feel like creating is the ultimate act of hope.
Yeah.
And really, when you start creating, when you start doing any creative act, and I use improv and painting a lot, but it could be anything. It
Do you
like
paint?
well, I try to, and
Okay.
here's my like, because my taste, what I like, what I think is good painting, my abilities have not caught up to that yet. So it is an act of hope every time I paint. No, really, because how many times do you let like your imposter syndrome and your self-doubt stop you from doing something that could bring you joy, that could bring you hope, that could bring, make you better?
Yeah.
You have to practice. Practicing that is my hope that someday I will get to the level that where I will really like it, like what I produce. But I like doing it because I feel like it's a small way. It's like a metaphor for like creating the life that I want, in the sense of like, I'm doing the things that I know will bring good things that I like, even
Uh-huh.
if I'm not where I really want to be or where I hope to be. There's still joy in that process.
Yeah. Creativity, I know, has always been important to you, and it was important to your late husband, Christopher.
Mhm.
And it was part of his life. It was also part of his trial and his illness. As he encountered each new stage of his terminal illness, ALS, he said something profound. He said, "I'll focus on what I can do, on what I can do." And that speaks to the hope that we're talking about. But
Yeah.
how does being like present in the moment, that can do right now in front of me, I have the paintbrush, I have the canvas, here's what I can do. How does that help point us toward joy?
So Christopher living with ALS was an exercise in ultimate patience, because we didn't know how fast he would lose abilities to move and to speak. We didn't know the progression. We didn't know where it would start: hands, voice, feet, whatever, how long he would have. And so he found that he was the most miserable when he was comparing himself to other friends, like through social media and things like that. Like, wow, they can just do that and they can take it for granted. And I used to too. And they can play with their kids and they can, do all this stuff that I can't do anymore. And he said, when I stopped comparing myself and just focused on what I still had, that's when he's like, I'm the happiest and I can still do it. So, for example, he used to be a concert pianist, and I mean, he could play anything. And one day he just shut the piano and said, my piano playing days are over. He was in a wheelchair by then. And I was like, you can still play. Why aren't you still playing? And he's like, because I can tell that my fingers are getting slow and it's just becoming frustrating. Like, it's not like I can work with a physical therapist and get stronger. We know because of the progression of this disease that I'm going to lose it. So instead of being frustrated and spending my time frustrated on things that I can't do, he's like, I can still teach. I can still direct plays. Like, I can still write. I can still do a lot of creative things. So I'm just going to focus on those now.
I want to say how brave of him, but the word that comes up is how smart of him. How
Oh, yeah.
smart of him.
Really,
Like, how
again, pragmatic.
like, well, but
Yeah.
how sad would that have been, right? I mean,
So
for him,
sad.
and
So
right.
sad.
So
Like, I went in the other, I was like, yeah, cool. Awesome, dude. And then I went in the other room and I cried because I
sure.
was like, when was the last time that he played where he
Yeah.
felt confident? I don't even remember. I don't even remember the last time I felt like I was robbed. So there is grieving to that. And I'm not just saying, like, don't think about it. Just don't think about all the bad things. It's not that. It is a conscious decision and a practice to lean in to the things that you love that you can still do that create happiness and joy that you can do. And it was interesting watching him in such a dramatic way, because then he lost his voice, so he couldn't teach anymore. And then he couldn't direct anymore. So then he could write, and he had to write with sort of a Stephen Hawking kind of setup to type things out by just moving his neck a little bit and one thumb. And he could type things out, and he could still create, and he could type out things and edit his life history that he had written. And he could still do creative things, but they were different. He could still make jokes. It just took a little bit longer. But then he could play to his increasing handicap, which was funny, and he could play into that. And he just found different ways of things that he could do, and didn't spend a lot of time let's talk about all the things I can't do. We didn't talk about all the things he
didn't
couldn't
stay in
do.
that space.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so as we go back to the joy toolbox, we've got hope, we've got mindfulness, really, but just being present, right? Pulling at Christopher Clark and just being present and focused
in the moment
and happy about what we can do. I want you to elaborate on this tool, as we're calling it, but it does speak to the arts and to your amazing craft. Like if you've watched Lisa do what she does, it's jaw on the floor. But as far as improv goes, there's this idea of accept and add. It's a skill that you use in improvisation on the stage that you say can help us in our lives find joy.
100%. So in improv, the real rule, there's pretty much just one. I mean, we can get granular about it, and there's so many great applications to life and how I see life. But the big one is yes and. So if you're on stage, anything can happen, right? There's no script. You get a suggestion, and whatever pops into your mind, you say it. And if your scene partner comes on and doesn't play along, then it stops the whole progression. So you may be coming on, and I may be, doing this motion. And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to mime that I'm wiping the windows. I'm washing windows.
That's what you're doing. That's what
going. I do. And that's what I'm thinking, but I'm just acting and I'm not saying anything. If my scene partner comes on and says, oh, hi, who are we waving to? Is that grandma? I can't see her. She's done the right thing, right? She's done yes and. She's interpreted the thing. She's accepted that I'm doing something with my hand. She hasn't ignored it. And she's adding to it. She's saying, oh, you're waving and saying hi to somebody. Let's do it. That's yes and. That's all it is. And then you just make another choice, and it creates a scene, and it can create anything. And you don't try to be funny or anything. It just moves.
But if you were to say, no, grandma's not here, I'm washing the windows, and take it back, that would ruin the whole thing.
Yeah. So if you negate it and say no, but, then it'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm washing the windows. Who's grandma? What, you're not, we're not related. I've just negated everything. And that makes her feel uncomfortable. It makes the audience feel uncomfortable. And nothing's been created. You have to start over. Now what do you say? Now where do you go? So I just feel like that's a principle for life of you have something like a terminal disease. Let's just use that example. There are a lot of ways that we could have denied it, right? Yeah. We could have said, well, maybe we'll find, listen, we tried a lot of weird potions hoping for some miracle cure, but we didn't deny that it was happening, right? But lots of people deny things that happen in their lives and just think if we don't think about it or look at it or accept it or talk about it, then maybe it'll go away. And I just don't think that's the way to move forward in life. But negating it and not adding to it, but just trying to we got to try to stop it. How can we stop it from happening is different than how do we live with it, right? Mm-hmm. So the yes and application for the terminal disease is your legs are really weak. You know what? If you had a wheelchair, you could conserve your energy and actually have more time and more energy to spend with your family instead of just sleeping and being tired and pretending like you can just still walk. Okay, let's get you in a wheelchair now then, and every progression of the disease. Okay, so now you can't, you're losing your voice and you're not going to be able to talk. So let's bank your voice. Let's get you used to this computer program so that when you can't use your voice, you can still communicate and you won't be frustrated. And then you can still laugh and talk with your friends. You can still teach. You can still, interact with your children. You can still make jokes, and it will be less frustrating if you accept it and add this technology. Okay, let's do that. And Christopher, he's like, it's so interesting because I didn't want people to think I was handicapped, and I was so resistant at first. But then when I figured out how easy it made my life, and it gave me more energy to do the things I love to do, like creating and being with people, then I saw the wisdom in it. But it takes a lot of humility to live that way. It takes a lot of humility.
You're describing that and I'm thinking, but what if the yes and is so sad and so hard and
It
so
is.
challenging? It is.
That's life.
That's life. There we go.
Well, as I
think
like
know
to
the
say,
title of this conversation.
That's showbiz, baby. And there is a time and a place too, because I think a lot of pushback that I get about like, or hesitation to really want to lean into this idea that joy is a creative act and to think about it in creativity. And this yes and building to it is that you're ignoring the negative. And or you're ignoring your like hard feelings like depression and grief. If you are really living in a yes and, that is part of it. That it is not the exception getting you out of the creative phase. It is in it. Just like when you paint, you're going to make a mistake. Just like when you're in improv, you're going to give an offering that's dumb that you wish you could take back. You're going to missay a word, forget somebody's name. It's part of the whole creative act. And so instead of being surprised and shocked by those feelings of frustration and depression and agony, President Nelson said, where you feel like you're going to be consumed by like grief and your feelings, which were Christopher and I both had those moments during that as we're trying to do it. But as you accept that and feel your feelings, anybody who's experienced grief knows that the harder you try to suppress it, the bigger it's going to just smack you in the face, like a beach ball that you're trying to shove under the water. The harder you try to shove it, the more velocity it's going to have when it pops up. But just to let you feel those feelings, it is part of that process of feeling grief. It is.
I'm thinking of this yes and principle, and you've given us just a beautiful macro example. It could apply to the micro too, right? The way that women, I don't want to stereotype, but we tend to grip and squeeze and control or try to control every aspect of our day, which amounts to our lives. But to Chris's point, it makes it harder to try to control and resist the beach ball. So it's going to be hard. It might be sad. It might be distressing, as President Nelson said. But ultimately, letting go of at least that one layer of pain, the control or the desire to control, might make it that much easier.
I think so. I think there is an active trust that needs to happen. And sometimes when I don't trust and I still feel that anxiety and that unsureness and that want for control, the thing that leaves me out of that is to go back to, do I believe Christ? Do I? And if I do, then how will that change the way that I live my life? How will that change the way I speak to people, speak to my kids? How will that change the way that how I spend my day and what I talk about? And how will that change what I think in this moment? So
there's the active part of the active trust that you described.
Because if you don't feel it, you can act like it in order to feel it. Like I can exercise faith and not be sure. That's what exercising faith is. And being like, I think so. I think I can love in this situation. Well, then what would somebody who loves in this situation say, do, feel, act?
Yeah. We've established joy as not a formula, but a creative act. I'm going to be thinking about you and thinking about that for a long time to come. But you say it can be fast-tracked. Let's end here. It can be fast-tracked when you focus on gratitude. Yeah. How has gratitude, Lisa Valentine Clark, helped you create joy?
Well, I think gratitude is the biggest hack to live in the present, right? So if you're having a hard time, you're worried about the past, or you're longing for the past, or you're worried about the future, then you're not living in the present. And the way to fast track to live in the present, which is like creating your life, actually doing the thing that we're talking about, doing the thing, is gratitude. And by looking around, if you wonder, is God with me? Does he know me? Does he even care? Does he exist? Looking for evidence of God's love everywhere is just a gratitude practice, right? I mean, we know scientifically that you find what you're looking for. So it does feel like work to be grateful. And, there's lots of gratitude practices. I'm glad that we're talking about it openly in our society, in and out of a gospel setting of, writing a gratitude journal, practicing mindfulness and meditation, is an act of being in your body and being present, being grateful. Serving other people is an expression of gratitude. Being able to give to worthy causes is a physical way to show gratitude. Communicating and talking to people and giving thanks and giving them your full attention and time is a way to give a person your gratitude. I think any of those like gratitude practices, it fast tracks you to living in the present. And also it has this beautiful byproduct, writing, creative act, serving other people, a creative act, intentionally and mindfully living in your body is a grateful act. All of those things bring you joy as they're just natural byproduct, and they force you to be in the present, which actually enhances your ability and capacity to feel joy.
We're creative beings.
We are. We're so creative. All of us, each one of us.
We can be joyful too. Thank you so much for your bright light, your testimony. As always, Lisa, we love you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Magnify. And as a quick reminder, it's not too late to sign up for the book club that's happening this Thursday night at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. We will be sitting down with author Carrie Scarda of The Practice of Stillness and discussing her book with our community. It's a great time to come, cameras on, share in the community, and just have the chance to chat with one another. It's going to be so much fun. I can't wait to see you there. All the details for that will be linked in the show notes. Also, don't forget to follow us over on Instagram at Magnify Community, where we will continue these amazing conversations. Thank you so much for being a listener of the Magnify podcast, and we'll see you next week where we will be hearing from Sister Rosemary Wixom about finding Jesus in the temple. It's going to be a great start to some amazing conversations about drawing on the power of God. All right, have a good week, and we'll see you next time.